introduce the first two speakers. Linda will introduce the other two. But it's my pleasure to introduce the first two speakers.
Speak into the mic, please.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Put it on my chin. Eat it. An ice cream cone. Right. Well, Linda Merigliano, our first speaker, and I go all the way back to her high school days when we used to backpack in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. So she has made her passion, her profession, and works as a recreation and wilderness manager for the Forest Service in the Bridger Teton right here in Jackson. But I also want to mention that she's a real collaborator with people and organizations here in the community. So many of you may already know her. And I think tonight's talk attests to that kind of collaboration, which is wonderful. Linda and her husband, Mike Merigliano, the second speaker, met doing trail work in the Adirondack Mountains in New York. And after college at Cornell and Paul Smith's, came out west to Idaho and did graduate work. And Mike went on to get his PhD at Montana University and currently consults often with government. So, and tonight, being a student of many disciplines, he's going to be our geologist for the Gros Ventre area. So please welcome our two first guests.
Tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. It's a huge occasion for us in that Jackson Hole, Jackson Hole in many ways is the birthplace of the wilderness movement. And so to have this talk on the eve of the anniversary is really special for us. And tonight what our plan is to give you a little bit of a sense of what wilderness is and its importance to Jackson Hole, and particularly with a highlight on the Gros Ventre Wilderness in Jackson's backyard. And then give you a sense of the broad landscape of the geology of the Gros Ventre Wilderness, and then a tour that'll be provided by Susan Marsh. And I'd like to say just up front is Susan Marsh has been in Jackson forever, and she knows everything about the natural history and geology of this region. And things, I can't say it any better than that. She's been my mentor for a lot of years and really knows the land intimately. And so it's a real honor for us to be able to do this presentation together. And we're also going to end with a first-hand account that will be a surprise at the end. But also, I do want to mention that we're going to raffle off at the end of tonight's talk 50th anniversary commemorative poster of the Wilderness Act. So if you put your name in a hat, we'll raffle that off and things. So, without further ado, the Gros Ventre Wilderness, this is a tour of its unique geology. But if you would indulge me first on just a little bit about what wilderness is and why it matters is as this country was growing and expanding, there was a couple of really key threats that a number of people were concerned about. That expanding settlement and growing mechanization that was sweeping the country. There was also at the same time, and starting in the 20s and 30s, a growing awareness that humans might need nature. And that it was something that beauty in nature was something deep in our roots that we couldn't live without. And I think this is captured most eloquently by Wallace Stegner. That something will have gone out of us as a people if we ever let the last of the wilderness be destroyed. and things. So there was this growing sentiment that this was important. And with the great debates over damming the wild rivers in Hetch Hetchy and then later in Dinosaur Park, there was a sense that if we were going to protect this nature and wild places and really give them permanent protection, it couldn't be just an administrative designation. It had to be permanent. And the best way to get permanent protection was to have an act of Congress. And Sonnheiser saw this as a very positive program where we can be at peace and not forever feel that the wilderness is a battleground. Let's make this be the best paper we can get. And so that culminated with the signing of the Wilderness Act on September 3rd, 1964. And this was the result of 8 years of debate, 66 rewrites of this legislation. Every word very meticulously. It was a citizen-led effort, and it's with leadership from the Wilderness Society and many others. And it really is one of the most poetic, beautifully written pieces of legislation we have. Lyndon Johnson signed it, and I'll note that, right there, Marty Murray and things. So she had the honor of being present. The other woman there is, if folks don't recognize, is Alice Sonnheiser. So the wife of Howard Sonnheiser, who was the key author of the act and things. And so they were. Well, this would be a. I don't know, but I could probably find out for you. So it culminated in signing the act, and it really was seen as there was something, not just for individuals, but for society at large, that we needed to protect this legacy of our heritage and our natural heritage, that was important to our democracy and to our country. So the purpose of the act was, again, remember those threats that were sweeping the country particularly after World War II, is in order to ensure that an increasing population, accompanied by that expanding settlement and growing mechanization, does not occupy and modify all areas, leaving no lands designated for preservation and protection of natural condition. It's the policy of Congress to secure for the American people, present and future generations, not just of today, the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. So what did the Wilderness Act do? It really did four things. First, and this is fairly neat, it created a national wilderness preservation system. So it isn't just one areas or those areas that were considered wilderness at the time. It created a system and then a process that allowed for adding new areas. And only Congress could add those areas. So it gave that permanent protection. And so what started out in 1964 as 54 areas that were automatically included, including some of the areas here in Jackson, is now grown to 758 areas and almost 110 million acres. It did two other things. It defined wilderness, and it set the direction for managing wilderness in a broad sense. And particularly in terms of what wilderness is, it really is distinguished from any other kind of land in that it is the only piece of legislation that says that the earth and the community of life are untrammeled, meaning that the areas are not controlled or manipulated by humans. So we adapt to nature. We don't try to control nature to suit us. And it's undeveloped, it's natural, and it has outstanding opportunities for solitude and a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. So this is the definition of wilderness that applies to every area, no matter the diversity, whether it's a little island or a really remote area, it all needs to meet this definition. So now how does the Gros Ventre fit into that? It really goes back to, again, the Muries. is they were very instrumental. Olis and Marty were early advocates and the principal advocates for having the Gros Ventre be protected. And this photo is courtesy of the Muri Center, and ironically, I have a quote from Harvey Broom, who was, along with Olis, one of the founding members of the Wilderness Society, and they were obviously were probably on this trip together in 1948. And then in the 50s, some folks here may remember Dr. Don McLeod was a key person who helped really advocate for the protection of the Gros Ventre. And then in the 70s, the first citizen proposals to draft legislation to protect the Gros Ventre were introduced. And then finally, in 1984, with passage of the Wyoming Wilderness Act, the Gros Ventre was designated. And so it is permanently protected as part of the National Wilderness Preservation System. So some of the, in reading the House reports, Cliff Hansen was instrumental in this, in introducing the act, and the congressional delegation here in Wyoming, and many citizens that were involved in the 70s and 80s to make this happen. It was the key, the central part of the Wyoming Wilderness Act was the Gros Ventre. And the key reasons that they mentioned in passing this was certainly this was the largest roadless area for protecting the Jackson Hole elk herd and the other game that was here. And let me put on my glasses for this. The second thing that relates directly to our talk tonight is that it was specifically noted that the Gros Ventre contains several interesting and unique expressions of geology. And that was one of the reasons for designating this as wilderness. It also, again, was a large wild country that linked the Wind Rivers to the Teton-Yellowstone area. The watershed values are of utmost importance in many of the wildernesses that are designated, and the opportunities for hunting, outfitting, and backpacking. So now we're going to turn to a landscape view of the Gros Ventre's geology.
Can you hear me? Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, for the next few slides or so, think yourself as a bird.
Use the mic, please.
Maybe I'll just use this. Is that better?
No.
Boy, okay. Mick Jagger. So yeah, these are all going to be the bird's eye view. And this is a hill slope terrain map of the Gros Ventre Cape Hornet here. And I'll put some landmarks on here. A lot of people know the Gros Ventre slides. Oh, sure, okay. At the time, that slid in 1925. That was the largest landslide in North America in historic times. But you'll see that's not the only one in the Gros Ventre. Here's some other landmarks. The Gros Ventre River makes a big bend, goes out through the north there. Sheep Mound, or the Sleeping Indian, most people know that. Tosai Basin, we'll have some slides of that area. I think that's the last one here. So I'll point out some other features, but I wanted to get a few things on there so you have some sense of what I'm talking about. Before I really get into the Gros Ventre, I must admit I got really excited about this area up here. When we're talking unique geology, I have a little trouble with the Gros Ventre being unique. Every place is unique. I guess you can say every place is an anomaly, and the Gros Ventre is no exception. But a lot of the stuff in the Gros Ventre is found in other places. I mean, it's a unique combination of things, but there isn't anything in the Gros Ventre that you probably wouldn't find other spots. But the place here is sort of kind of rolling terrain, not too many people go in there, is the deepest tertiary deposit in I think, North America, maybe the world. And it's not really part of the Gros Ventre. It actually came from a phantom mountain way over where the Target National Forest is, and eroded away and flowed through here in a big lowland area and built up this huge, basically this was a big low-lying valley, full of dinosaurs and other things. And now it's a big, huge gravel deposit. Gravel Mountain, some of you probably know that. That's part of that same deposit. It goes clear up to Yellowstone. It's just huge. And these formations, the dominant ones are the Harebell and the Pinyon conglomerate are found nowhere else. So that's a unique thing. So anyway, just some more, if you're thinking, here's Jackson, there's Black's Hill Butte, East Gros Ventre Butte, just to get you a little more oriented here. Cache Creek, this is the state of Wyoming section. So there you go. We're going to use this boundary as a reference for the rest of these slides. So here's a really simplified map of, well, it is. I spent hours on this. We could go, all the geologic maps, you don't have to go to the library and look in lesson files and spread them out. They're all on the web now, and so I pulled this off the, I think it's the Wyoming Geological, or maybe USGS, but they're probably both have the Wyoming Geological Survey. And there's a lot of rock units, and what I did was group them. And for example, argillite, that's a lot of claystone, silts, siltstone and shales, really fine grained sedimentary rock. Most of it marine origin, but some of it freshwater. And that is more, let's see where we're looking here, the colors. I kind of put these two the same color, but a lot of this north slope is shales, and also some in here. So if you ever walk up into the Gros Ventre from, say, Big Cow Creek, which is a common trail, you kind of break out of these big kind of meadowy valleys that are really gentle, and then they're surrounded by these kind of bigger peaks like Darwin Peak and some others. Well, that's these argillite shales. So I put a lot of rock types into this, and if I didn't do that, just for this unit, there'd probably be 6 to 8 more colors here, and I was starting to run out of colors. So that's just an example there. Plutonic, that's deep-seated rocks, batholiths, magmatic rock that forms underneath country rock, like mostly granitics here. And those are the really old ones. We'll get to that in a little bit. And those are in this province here and a little bit over here. Jackson Peak is probably about in here somewhere. Jackson Peak is part of that group, all the way over to Gros Peak, and a little bit over towards Pinnacle Peak. Not a whole lot of it exposed, but if you really wanted to and dug a really deep hole, you'd probably find it here too. This all beds down across here. And then this kind of, I don't know what color that is, but you can see it. That's the big expanse of limestones and dolomites that dominate the higher, sharper country. And then this yellow is alluvium, and you can see that it tends to be on the margins. That's all more recent stuff that basically washed out of the mountains, like with stream deposits or glaciers. And then some of this here is not from the Gros Ventre, but came out of it flowed from the north through Jackson Hole, the Jackson Hole Basin. Huge glaciers out of the Beartooth Plateau and Yellowstone pushed a lot of sediment into Jackson Hole. So a lot of this yellow stuff is not from the Gros Ventre. But I wanted to have a little bit of a buffer around the wilderness boundary, because the world doesn't really stop there. And then these black patches, that's landslides. And so that, of course, that's a dominant feature in the Gros Ventre as well. And then there's some sandstone and mixed clastic carbonates, which I didn't have time to figure out exactly what that was, but there's not too much of it. So that's kind of that's a simplified view. It's the geology is pretty complicated in the Gros Ventre. So here is another map. Again, this is simplified of rock ages or deposit ages. And the scale is over here. So aged millions of years ago from today is this here. So Quaternary is what we're in now. So starting at 0, and then I just put some major era breaks here, just so it didn't get too complicated. But the main patterns you see is generally the rock tends to young to the northeast. So as you go northeast, the rock gets younger, at least on the surface. And then another interesting pattern here is instead of it getting older and older this way, we have younger rocks again. Well, there's a huge fault here, and Susan will have a picture of an example of that fault. So as you're walking from, say, the Gros Ventre to the southwest, you're actually going back in time. And if you really want to go back in time really fast, is hike up Jackson Peak. And most of Jackson Peak is in this Archean or Precambrian. I think Susan used Precambrian for this bunch of ages here. And at the top of Jackson Peak, just like Mount Moran and some other peaks, is flathead sandstone. And that's Cambrian. So from Archean, this really old stuff, and you skip all this, you go all the way to Cambrian in 5 steps. So if you really like to time travel, that's one thing to do. Now we get into landslides. This is the whole state of Wyoming, the landslides that have been mapped. And kind of the point here is if there's mountains, there's landslides. If you know where the mountain ranges are in Wyoming, and I didn't put them in because I thought it was kind of fun not to, you'd know that wherever you see all these black patches, there are mountains. This is the Green River Basin, Bighorn Basin, Red Desert, all the high plains here. I was a little surprised there were no landslides in the edge of the Black Hills. And Jackson Hole, Yellowstone, which is mostly flat volcanic. So if you've got steep country, you've got some landslides. A little closer, this is the northwest corner of Wyoming. And here's the Gros Ventre Wilderness again. And there's quite a few here, but boy, there's lots of landslides. Here's the overthrust belt. The highway goes through here. We know there's been some landslides along the highway to Hoback. The mother of all landslides in Wyoming seems to be this one. It's huge, it's old, but it's there, and that's around Carter Mountain near Cody. Cody sits back up here. So this little guy right here is the Gros Ventre slide, so that gives you a sense of the size. And I think this one, or this one, is the landslide at Upper Slide Lake, which came down in 1908. And so that's a pretty recent one, too. And the Gros Ventre used to be a pretty important travel corridor between Jackson Hole Basin and the Green River. There wasn't a highway through the Hoback at that time. They didn't build that for a while. And then these landslides kind of made that difficult, so I think people said, the heck with that, and started going different ways. But so far these maps have showed you all the landslide types, from rock glaciers, which are pretty slow, to something like the Gros Ventre, which was a rock, basically a rock slide that came down in probably less than an hour. So here is a map of the more exciting ones. I screened out, again, this was all in digital form, GIS and whatnot. I just screened out sort of the slow, alluvial fans and anything that sort of moved to the ones that are maybe what we think of as a landslide, like the Gros Ventre. And there's still quite a few. A lot of these are old, prehistory, but they're out there, and they possibly could reactivate. So just to give you an idea, there's a lot of landslides there, and you can see, obviously, whoops, sorry about that. This again, the Gros Ventre River goes through here, the road. This whole front, which is along the shale and limestone combination, is quite concentrated. Talk a little bit about cirques and alpine glaciation. It's not quite as prominent as some other, particularly the Tetons, but some parts of the Gros Ventre have some pretty distinct cirques in them. This is on Black Peak, taken by Elliot Blackwelder. I thought I'd mention him. These may be the first pictures of the Gros Ventre Wilderness from 1909. In fact, he has one of the famous Gros Ventre slide, but it wasn't the one that we know. It's the one at Upper Slide Lake. It was the one at Lower Slide Lake hadn't been down yet. So at that time, the famous Gros Ventre Slide was the one that people just drive over and might not even notice. That blocked upper slide maybe. So I just kind of messed around a little bit and retook this just a few weeks ago, and you can see it hasn't changed a lot. There's some change in number of, white bark pines, some of the conifers, not a whole lot. The snow actually matches pretty well too. You can see there. So I just thought I'd kind of throw that in, but we're supposed to have a bird's eye view, so I should stick with that. So here we go. Just an example here. Here's some really prominent cirques on the side of Sheep Mountain, which is here's the top of the Sleeping Indian here. Here's some more here. Here's Hidden Basin. This is Crystal Creek that comes out. And then you see as you go out to here, there isn't much, even here. Part of the reason for that is probably there was more snow here. It's closer to where the precip comes. It's higher country, but also it's into a rock layer, probably Madison limestone and some others that are strong cliff formers. So the rock is hard enough to maintain a cliff for thousands of years, whereas in this more shaly country, it just essentially erodes it away, and it's sort of like trying to carve a soft piece of butter. It just doesn't stay. And then here's an example. This is the lake, one of the lakes below Sleeping Indian. I think, do you know which one where that is? Oh, okay, it's below Table Mountain, which is a little more northwest of Sheep. And just a little bit more on glaciation. There's 3 main stages of glaciation in the Rocky Mountains and other places. And again, Elliot Blackwelder worked this out, mainly in the Wind River Mountains. The most recent is Pinedale, and that's what kind of put the finishing touches on the mountains here. Tended to be a little less extensive, less intense, but it was the last one, so the moraines really show up pretty well. And then Bull Lake, which was another fairly large one, and probably did the most carving in the Gros Ventre as well as the other ranges, but it's older and it doesn't show up quite as much. And again, the Pinedale kind of, reworked this. And then the Buffalo, I mean, I just say 200,000 years ago, we don't really know the duration of this because it was so long ago, and a lot of the evidence is really hard to figure out. I'm not really sure of this, but my travels in the Gros Ventre, it seems to me that the most prominent moraines in the valleys themselves are Bull Lake. And I've seen some smaller, fresher moraines, more up in the drainages that are probably Pinedale. And in my reading, the glaciers came out to basically the edge of the Jackson Hole Basin in the Bull Lake. They didn't make it very far down in the Pinedale. In contrast to the Tetons, where the Pinedale created some fairly large moraines, like in front of Bradley and Taggart, Burnt Ridge below Jackson Lake. I mean, some pretty big moraines in the Jackson Hole Basin. And if you want to see a Bull Lake moraine, Timbered Island, probably a lot of people ride or walk or drive by it. On the way to Jenny Lake, it's that timbered patch in the middle of the sagebrush to the right, just after you pass Cotton Creek. That's a Bull Lake. I think that's all I have. The birds. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
There. Okay. Everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit, and I'm going to lead us all on a geologic tour of the Gros Ventre Wilderness with an emphasis on the scenic values that are created from the geology. And starting with just this introductory slide, when you think of the Gros Ventre, especially the high mountains, think limestone. There are many, many layers of limestone, mostly Paleozoic through mid-tertiary. When you get a little later, it's softer rock. But this is the Bighorn and the Derby, and at the top of the sequence, the Madison. in this area. And so again, another little photograph or map of the wilderness starting at the southeast corner where the Tosai Basin is. We'll kind of go around the edge of the wilderness and hit a few places in the center to show some of the unique places that we can find there. First, the Tosai Basin. This is one of the best places to see karst topography. And this photograph near the Sawtooth in kind of the upper end of the Tosai Basin. Did this die? Oh no, okay. The upper end of the Tosai Basin, you're seeing some of the rocks in the Sawtooth itself in this cliffy stuff. And then the lower foreground is a really not very steeply tilting Madison limestone, and that's where most of the karst formations are found. A lot of rivulets and terraces and sinkholes and places where the creek itself goes underground. This is the other side of the Tosai Basin looking from the south, and Tosai Peak is on the far right on the top of the Sawtooth there. And this is part of the big fault that Mike was talking about a few minutes ago. In this area, there's about 2,000 feet of displacement along this fault. Going farther west is West Dell Creek, and this picture was taken near West Dell Falls. And unfortunately, it was a bright day, so the Chugwater Formation doesn't have its usual dark, muddy red color, but those are nearly vertical tilting Chugwater Formation Triassic soft rocks near the falls itself. And then farther back, you're basically looking at the crest of the Gros Ventre and Hodges Peak over on the right, the older limestones that stand up more. That whole south end of the Gros Ventre is a large anticline, and this photograph shows it pretty well. Shoal Peak is in the foreground, and you can see the big curving limestones in that exposure. And both on, let's point these out, right here and over here. That's the Precambrian or the Archean. There really isn't any Proterozoic much. The flathead sandstone sits directly on top of much older rock, and there's a large unconformity there. And then double, oops, oh, I knew I was going to do that. Sorry, you guys. Double top here, again, is the Paleozoic limestones. We'll see another view of that in a minute. Okay, here's one of the most beautiful places in the Gros Ventre Wilderness, Shoal Lake. And what's really neat about this picture, not only does it show a classic tarn, and the rock is hard enough, you can see where the glacier gouged it out and left the tarn. This is part of the Archean gneisses mostly. But this, according to Dave Love, this part of the gneiss was intruded by what he calls a red biotite granite. And you can see those intrusions in this area. Of the three, well, I can't make the calculation, but it's over 300,000 acres, the entire wilderness, and about 21 square miles of it has the oldest rocks, these Archean rocks showing. So they don't crop out very many places, but this is one of the places they do. And if I can get the right button, here's Shoal Peak from the north. So you'll see really cliffy, steep, north-facing slopes on that limestone that is up against this older rock. And then here's where Shoal Creek comes down through the Madison limestone to create Shoal Falls. Beautiful spot. And here's a few little smaller scale items. There's some really interesting weathering. And yes, this is about bench high and looks sort of comfortable until you sit on it. It's extremely rough. The limestone weathers into these little pockets, and in some places you can find moss or even wildflowers growing in the little pockets. And when those pockets erode out, what you get left is points. This is a piece of a photograph of the Rex chert, which is actually part of the Phosphoria. It's at the top of the Phosphoria Formation, which is Permian. And these are cylinders. They look like worms or something. Black chert with some shale in them, and sitting unconformably under the Dinwiddie Formation here. There are some fossils. The Madison has quite a few, so does the Gallatin. This one, some nice brachiopods that are black against the very light-colored rock. And here's something cool. Anybody who's been on the west slope of the Tetons in the Jed Smith Wilderness will recognize these stromatolites. They're just little humps, and they're Cambrian algae mats, similar to algae mats that can still be found in the area off of Australia today, but these guys lived 500 million years ago. The ones in the Gros Ventre Wilderness, right here, where the arrows are not as pronounced or tall, but they're basically the same thing. So there's a few places where those show up. This is Granite Creek flowing into the Hoback, and I put this slide in here just to show that the rocks that don't erode easily, the granites and other really hard rocks, even at runoff, are still pretty clear, whereas the Hoback, there's a couple of tributaries up there that have a lot of chug water in them. The Jam Creek is one of them. Turns the river pretty dark red sometimes. Also in Granite Creek, lots of stratigraphy above the granite. All these limestone layers are very prominent in the lower part of Granite Creek. And there is one little spot here where a natural bridge has formed by gully erosion. More glacial evidence, large erratic that is easily seen from the Granite Creek Road. I'm sure a lot of people have seen it. And then directly behind it, you're looking straight up the canyon of Swift Creek, and you can see that classic U-shaped valley. A few caves are known in the southern Gros Ventre. Most of them are in the Madison Formation. This one's in Swift Creek. There's a few others. And moving farther west, we have a little bit of nugget sandstone on top of this peak, and most of everything else is the kind of really soft Jurassic and later rocks that are, there was glaciation here, but you can't really tell anymore because it's so soft it has eroded away. And one of the good things about this, it may not be as interesting geologically, but it makes for some very deep, fine-grained soils. And some of the best wildflower parks are found in some of these creeks, Bull Creek, Cow Creek, in that area. Okay, we're getting a little closer to home here. This is Cache Creek and Nolan Peak, which sits on the north ridge of Cache Creek. Thanks to Bev Boynton for this photograph. You can see the dramatic fold, and I just wanted to point out a little bit of the geologic map to give a sense of how complex the geology is here. Right here is the top of Nolan Peak, and it's in the Bighorn Dolomite. And then we've got a sequence going, this is pretty much in sequence going down to the Cambrian Gallatin Formation and the Gros Ventre Formation. But then the summit block of Nolan Peak is surrounded by faults. And the down-thrown block is the one with a little lollipop on the side of the line. And so this was actually pushed up relative to everything around it. And when you go over on this side of the fault, you have some overturned beds, and the whole works is faulted up against the Precambrian. So it gives a sense of the rather tortured and complex history of this little bit of Cache Creek. Mike mentioned in his talk about Goodwin Lake and Jackson Peak, where you can see the Archean rocks, approximately 2.6 billion years old. the huge unconformity that nobody knows what happened for about 1 billion years, and then the flathead sandstone was deposited on top of the older rocks, and as he mentioned, same as the top of Mount Moran and a bunch of other places. So just another good place to see the oldest rocks that we have around here. Moving north to the Sleeping Indian or Sheep Mountain, another good place to see the stratigraphy. Starting, here's the summit, Madison limestone, and also, well, actually the summit is here. That's the nose. So the top's Madison, and then it goes down to the Darby and all the way down to the Flathead Sandstone, which is the oldest in this sequence. Landslides. I'm done, and someone else can take over. Thanks.
As Mike mentioned earlier, and one of the notable things in the House report that accompanied the legislation was noting that the North Quadrant from Sportman Ridge to the Gros Ventre Slide contains one of the largest concentrations of landslides in Wyoming. And I think that one of the things here was the more notable recent landslides, and of course this being in many earth science texts that you probably saw in school. And the Gros Ventre Slide, very, very notable, and certainly one of the largest in recent memory. And a picture of it today. I wanted to mention here that one of the reasons that public purposes of wilderness is for its scientific value. And we do have a considerable amount of research going on in the wilderness, and including on the Gros Ventre National Geological Area. So I brought the 2 recent reports. The research is ongoing, and they're on the back table if anyone wants to look at those. But the research that's going on right now is showing that there's parts of this slide that are still moving. And there's definitely, in 2011, which was a particularly wet year, there was definitely movement within the interior of this area. So it isn't asleep. And we have a couple of other reports from the Gros Ventre and David Love's work of this area. But this is the exciting thing in our time, is the Crystal Peak landslide. And this is an old landslide that, this is from 2006, and I'm going to point out, this is the top of Crystal Peak right here. So the landslide is activated and is moving this direction. And this is Crystal Creek right here, going up through here, and Jag Creek is over on this side. So keep your eye out on this. This was 2006. Keep an eye on the Crystal Creek and this meadow area. So in 2007, we get a call from Gapucci, who's the outfitter that for a long time worked in this area. And he said, I think you might want to go up Crystal Creek because I can't get my horses up there. This is what had happened. Thanks. The landslide decided it wasn't a particularly wet year. We checked records, no earthquake was recorded in that area, but the landslide had clearly activated, and there was a lot of debris on top of the trail. In looking at this area in 2007, when flew over it, there was some what are called sag ponds that were up in this area. 2008, kind of a wet year, it decided to grow. And particularly this area down in here. So now you see where Crystal Creek is gotten shoved up against the hillside there, and this meadow is kind of gone. 2012, recent year, we have a brand new lake, and so we've named it Crystal Lake. the newest lake on the topo map, and it continues to grow a little bit. So the state geologist, we've taken him up in this area. It's the largest landslide in recent times in Wyoming. He's working on a fuller report on this landslide, but it's not. He wants to do a little more work on this before he publishes the report. But this is the bird's eye view. So 2007, when we first got the report, this was what it looked like from the ground. I'll point out, here was our trail. And this is why Gabucci couldn't get his horses through. And here, this was really interesting. This is the toe of the slide and this meadow area. So the creek is now out in the meadow, and the creek bed is on top of here. And just in this area here, this is what the ground looked like. It just buckled into these big, huge folds from the weight of that. And again, remember, this was just the rock slide. The mud hadn't shown up. This is what it looked like when the mud showed up. So our meadow is pretty well gone, and the creek has now been pushed against the hillside, and that's where we had tried to put the trail, and then this is now the new lake that's forming. So I'm going to ask Mike Penterson, who, we have a number of folks here that are our wilderness crew and our trail crew that have been up in this area trying to constantly figure out how to keep Crystal Creek open for the public.
So I'm going to start this out by saying Crystal Creek is one of my favorite places in the Gros Ventre, and I could probably talk for a long time about it, but I've been told to keep it short. So basically, Linda kind of gave you a brief timeline of it, but I first saw it in 2007. I don't know if you remember this or not, but we were on top of the Red Cliffs at the top of TB Creek, and we looked over and saw this huge landslide on the mountain, and we asked Linda how long that had been there. And she just kind of looked at it and was like, no, I don't know. So a few weeks later, we get sent, we're part of the trail crew, and we get sent up Crystal Creek to do a small reroute around this landslide. You saw the pictures of the trees down across the trail and everything. So we worked for about 3 days, cutting up trees and establishing a reroute around this. And we finish up the project, and Tim, the trail supervisor, says, "Oh, I'm just going to walk a little bit further and see if there's any more down trees we can clear while we're up here." So he comes back and he says, "We got a problem. There's a whole nother toe of the landslide, and it's about 30 feet tall, covering the trail." All right, I guess we're going to be back here sometime soon. So yeah, we took Sierra Club, a bunch of volunteers, out there later that summer, and we did another mile-long reroute around the next portion of the slide. And that was a good project, and it was a nice trail. And the next year, our wilderness rangers were up there, and they were camped in the same meadow that we were camped in while we were doing that project. And in the middle of the night, they had heard rocks coming down and stuff like that. In the middle of the night, one of them found he was floating in his tent in water. So they had to pack up and move camp in the middle of the night. But that's when that whole mud flow started moving and everything. This picture down in the lower left here. That wasn't there when we did our original reroute. So 2010 comes along, we're back in Crystal Creek, trying to find a route around this thing. And it's real tough country. It's real steep in there. It's rocky. Going across this portion of the landslide was pretty sketchy. We had tried to find a route across it, and just walking across it, if you stepped in the wrong spot, all of a sudden you're up to your crotch in mud, and it was sketchy. I wouldn't bring a horse across that for sure. So we were trying to find a route on the other side of the creek. So we put in another mile-long reroute or so in 2010. And again, we think, okay, we're done. 2011 comes along, and the lake starts to form. And maybe another just a few hundred yards of our trail got covered in water because the lake had come up. So we put in a small reroute again in 2011, and that is still there to this day. But yeah, it just kind of shows you how we've had to adapt to the changing landscape in here versus trying to just bulldoze a trail right through what was already there. But yeah, just some of my kind of fond memories of being up there. I remember that first trip hearing rock slides coming down in the middle of the night and everything. And then walking out on this, it's kind of like a desert environment actually. You can see a lot of cool animal tracks out there that have just been cemented in the mud there. Yeah, right there. We actually saw some pretty cool tracks of a mountain lion. You could see them step in, and then all of a sudden they slipped. And you could see the claw marks from that slip right there. But yeah, I highly recommend a trip up there. It's not too far, 4.5, 5 miles or so. And it's just such a cool feature. And to have all this happen in just the course of, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, it's pretty amazing. So, yeah, that's just kind of a first-hand account of what was happening up there.
I think that our main point to end with here is that in many ways, when the Gros Ventre was designated wilderness in 1984, they noted that the geology was one of the things that was really special about this area. But in many ways, the geology is what has played a key role in why we have so much wild country in Jackson Hole. Is two big things is for the Jackson Ranger District with the Bridger Teton Forest, 92% of our district is in some kind of protected designation. There's some kind of special protected area. And there's a reason for that, and alluded to it earlier, is that all of the landslides make it really difficult to get roads in a lot of places here. And so, the history of Jackson is that because of the active geology here, it was really difficult to keep roads in places. So people had to figure out more stuff and went by trail and things like that. And then also, we've gone through a lot of unique geology, but you'll notice that we haven't talked that there was significant mineral resources. And so despite the unique geology, it didn't have a lot of mineralization. And so we don't have the mining history here that was evident in Colorado or Utah or other places. And so it's the combination of really the geology that has led to why we have the wild country that we have, and in turn, that wild country then supporting the incredible wildlife resources that we all enjoy here. So thank the rocks for the wild country and things. So with that, I think we are ready for questions, and we can turn off the lights. I just answered that for the, answered that today. Even in terms of further protection. Yeah, there's, what Bev is referring to is she's asking what's happening with the Palisades and the Shoal Creek WSA. The Wyoming Wilderness Act designated 3 wilderness study areas. 2 of them are on the Bridger Teton and 1 was on the Shoshone Forest. And the 2 on the Bridger Teton are the Palisades and the Shoal Creek. The Palisades at Snake River here. The Shoal Creek is actually, is probably, you might guess from some of the pictures, is just south. It's contiguous with the Gros Ventre Wilderness, and it's just in that Granite Creek Bondurant front area and things. So those areas were included in the Wyoming Wilderness Act as study areas to allow the time to explore the oil and gas potential of the areas. So that was a hot topic at the time. And so what needs to happen now is at the time of forest plan revision, those areas will be re-looked at, and there'll be a recommendation of whether they should proceed for wilderness designation. But it's still going to take putting together proposed legislation and congressional support to advance those areas. So it's going to take a lot of citizen involvement, public involvement about the future of those areas, and that will probably start at the time of forest plan revision, which we're not quite sure when that will start, maybe in a few years. Susan did a lot of the work, initial work on it. She probably wants to see it happen before she's gone. So, other questions? Somebody.
In light of the fact that gravans are so slidey, you think that the digging into snow-king and putting lagoons on top of it, or carving shells for subdivisions like the blades is the wise thing to do? You know what I'm referring to? I'm talking about that within the last 10 years, we managed to carve out big holes on the bottom of snow-king.
Oh, okay.
Kind of undercutting, the very foundation of the mountain. Kind of the same thing that is happening with the bud slide. So my question is, do you see this as a reasonable thing to do in the town of Jackson to dig deeper into the snow?
I don't know if I want to take that. Is this being recorded? Yeah, it is. First of all, this is not the situation that we have over here on Bunch Drive. There's no 100-foot man-made cliff. There is excavation to create the property development over here that's occurred. There is absolutely no law that precludes that. If you think there should be, then you should talk to your legislators about that as a possibility, local or otherwise. So the scale of what we're seeing over here is nothing like the Bunch Drive situation. The trenches that they're doing for the snow making, the pipes, the water pipes that
I'm
go
not
up.
talking about that.
Okay,
I'm
yeah,
talking
that,
about
I mean,
the pine blades, and those trenches are pretty substantial. There are 2 shells cut into the bottom of the snow.
there are. I'll tell you how I would worry about it. I would worry about it if you go back and look at the historic photos of Jackson 100 plus years ago, when there were basically no trees on Snow King. There had been a very large fire, 100 plus years ago. If you had a big fire that stripped all the vegetation off that slope, then I personally would perhaps begin to worry about it. With all the vegetation, the trees and everything, do quite a good job of stabilizing the slopes. So you'd also have to worry about snow avalanches if you didn't have all those trees up there as well. I mean, there's maybe a house or two that I personally wouldn't buy, but I don't have that option. I don't know that I could afford them anyway, so it's not a question. Other questions for Mike or Linda or Susan?
Does anyone know what the bedrock is that Christopher slide is sliding on, or any details on that?
We know what it is for the Gros Ventre slide.
It's very similar
That's
to
one of
it's very similar to the Slide Lake slide. You have Pennsylvania sandstone, so it's roughly the same.
Say it again, John,
It's
for everybody.
just from looking at the picture, that's all I'm judging it by. There's the Pennsylvania sandstone is what slid, and that's what slid at Slide Lake too. You can tell by the color because the chug water's red and it's above it.
Yep.
There's something about the Pennsylvania sandstone that doesn't hold up well.
What's more important is what's underneath it.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's dipping.
Yeah.
And I thought one of the things that was really striking me is that 2007 was not a wet spring, and so typical compared to the Gros Ventre slide that heavy rain on snow events and really saturated soils and things. That wasn't the case in 2007, but that water would have been percolating down and then sitting on that sliding layer for a lot of years, and just finally decided that it was time to go.
Was that when the sag ponds were observed, or was that more recently?
the sag ponds were observed in 2007 after it initially activated. And then, I don't think that we had evidence of the sag ponds prior to 2007. So they were there, they got created during that activation of the slide and then let go in 2008 and 9.
So that's one way to lubricate it if they pre-existing.
Yep, yep. So, yes.
You didn't mention mountain lions living in that area. Would you like to talk about them?
They're there. The Gros Ventre, one of the things is it has pretty much every big megafauna. There's grizzly bears and black bears. It's one of the only wildernesses that has bison in the wilderness. Wolves, mountain lions are, we see the tracks quite often and things. So particularly in that Gros Ventre drainage. I think there's some places where you're pretty much guaranteed to be following mountain lion tracks up the trail.
Other side.
Yes?
Did the Crystal Peak slide affect the Six Lakes?
Ooh, that's a good question. The question was did Crystal, one of the things that I have not been able to find is when, historically, when did the Crystal landslide first slide? Haven't been able to find that. And so the question was, did that original slide affect the Six Lakes area, which is in kind of in the headwaters of Jag Creek. And it's a really interesting lake basin in that some of the lakes are like bathtubs, and they completely, in a dry year, they'll completely drain and become like little bathtubs. And others are full all the time. So I don't know an answer to that question, Terry. Yes.
You mentioned an unconformity. Where was that? What does it separate?
I will repeat the question. Can you hear me? Is this
Yes.
working? Okay. The question was the mention of an unconformity. Well, there were a couple of them mentioned. One was between the Rex Church and the Dinwiddie Formation, and that was an angular unconformity of not a huge amount of time, whereas the one between the Precambrian basement rocks and the Cambrian flathead sandstone represented about 1 billion years.
Where was the location of that?
2 billion years, okay. All right, I got that wrong. I can see there's my math, not so hot. But anyway, between 2.6 billion years ago and about 550 or thereabouts million years ago, there's no geologic record. And so that's an unconformity in terms of the rock that sits on the rock below it didn't get deposited directly there. There was a bunch of stuff that got eroded off first. So that's hopefully answers the question.
Where was that located?
The big one? I mentioned it on the top of Jackson Peak, where the flathead sandstone sits on top of the Archean gneisses. And it's similar to what we see on top of Mount Moran. That's also a flathead. So those are two places where it comes out. But there may be some others as well. Question here?
Yeah, can you touch on the ancient Gros Ventre range?
Ooh. Oh, well, I'm going to let Mike talk about that. He just said he could. But, go ahead. No.
So about 60 billion years ago or so was the beginning of the main mountain uplifting in the west. And you were saying there's the ancient Gros Ventre. It was basically the Gros Ventre, but probably extended over. I think you mentioned in the announcement, kind of where the Tetons are, and Rexburg was closer. Of course, Rexburg wasn't there, but that land was closer. So it was kind of a big, we don't know how sharp it was, but it was a big, broad mountain mass. And it didn't go quite as far north as it does now. And at the same time, roughly, there was another very large, extensive mountain range about where maybe Island Park, that northern Henrysport country, which is now all volcanic. The hot spot went through there and basically burned all that stuff off, but there's a huge quartzite and probably other things range there. And when that eroded, there was a low-lying area north of the ancestral Gros and Teton Dome, if you want to call it, and that's where all that gravel mountain, all the stuff north of the Gros Ventre River, most of it, is basically outwash or eroded material from this ancient quartzite-dominated peak. So, and those rocks flow now all the way down to Snake, probably all the way to the Columbia. Who knows? I mean, a long ways around. And a lot of the rocks you see, these big cobbles in the Snake River, are quartzite. Because quartzite's a really tough rock. It's made of quartz crystals. And the quartz crystals, just the way they are resistant to chemical weathering. And the quartzite, it's a metamorphic rock. It's basically sandstone that's made of the quartz crystals, really smushed together under heat and pressure. So they're really glued together. So you've got this mineral that's really hard to chemically weather, and it's glued together with super glue. And so these rocks last a long time. So they've been growing around for millions of years, and they're still coming down through the Jackson Hole Basin. So, and all that stuff came north of the Gros Ventre. And then about, 2 million years ago, when the basin and range extension started happening, more of a spreading, all through Nevada, the Sierras, whatever, newer mountains, including the Tetons, that block, well, by then, that quartzite mountain's probably gone. But even if it wasn't, the range lifted, and there was more volcanics, with the hot spot, Yellowstone. A lot of the northern Tetons are pretty big, thick layers of volcanic rock. So that blocked it. So it's weird. You go to the north part of the Tetons, like Red Mountains and other places, up high is this painted conglomerate, way up there, 10,000 feet or something. And that used to be way down in a big, huge stream system. Very fast-moving, cobble-bedded streams with back swamps. So there's dinosaurs, which everybody thinks is they're in swamps, really, low-lying areas. But this was a big, kind of like a Jackson Hole, Snake River braided system with a lot of apparently back swamps too, because there's a lot of sandstone, quiet water, freshwater deposits. I think the Mesa Verde is part of that. But anyway, it's a whole different place as you go north of the Gros Ventre River. It didn't come off the Gros Ventre, it came out of a mountain that was like 60 miles away. Does that answer your question? Are there some others?
I would like to follow from what you're saying, does this sound like the southern Tetons that we have right now used to be part of the Gros Ventre? Are they related to the Gros Ventre on this side?
Yeah, I think the question is the southern Tetons, was that part of the Gros Ventre?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the same layers are there. Yeah, I mean, really, when you think about it, there was a huge inland sea, or even just an ocean, that laid down all this limestone. So you can go up into Canada, Colorado, whatever, the same stuff. There are different combinations we can turn and swirl them around, but it's a lot of the same rocks there. That's what I was saying earlier. A lot of the rocks you see in the Gros Ventre are in other places, including the southern.
And you can see deformation, faulting, folding that is associated with the formation of the Gros Ventre Mountains. So in other words, you can see evidence in the Tetons, quite a few places when you walk, you know what to look for, that the Gros Ventres went right through where today's Jackson Hole and the Teton Range is. So the Tetons didn't have to come up that high to reach the elevation they are. In other words, if you look at the Gros Ventre, you can see what this area looked like before the formation of Jackson Hole and the Teton Range. Other questions, comments? There's a question over here.
Can you say something about the red and lavender hills?
Yeah, I guess the red is Chugwater. I'm not sure what the lavender hills are. You can answer that.
Cloverleaf.
Cloverleaf? And is that all Cretaceous? All that?
Jurassic up to Cretaceous. Lower Cretaceous.
Yeah. So it's relatively younger rock, you know, in that
Couldn't
north
hear that.
slope. Oh, a lot of that rock, you know, in the Gros Ventre corridor, a little north and a little south, is that younger rock from the last part of the sea, that inland sea, and brackish water that deposited there.
They couldn't hear the name.
Oh,
Cloverleaf Formation.
Cloverleaf. So it's mostly shale. Is that mostly shale?
Mudstone.
Mudstone.
Siltstone, so think of swamps.
Yeah, if
Yes,
you remember the
sea.
map I made, I had that argillite, which includes just tons of different fine-grained rock. There's a lot of that out there. And if I had included all those separately, that map would have been much, much more complicated. There's a lot of fine-grained, relatively recent sedimentary rock out there.
Think of the U.S. Gulf Coast, the ocean transgressing into over the alluvial system where there were lots of dinosaurs, the Morrison Formation, which some of you will be familiar with. As the ocean came in, you deposited those muds that today form Gulf River Formation. Rocks there above the Chugwater.
Other questions? Okay, so the exciting raffle. Oh, okay. Shake it up, shake it up. Pick out a name and hopefully you can read it. Susan Tilling. So, anyways, again, thank you all so much for coming. I want to thank Casey Stewart has really been instrumental in helping coordinate all of our Wilderness 50th events, and we've got more coming up next Tuesday night. We're going to focus on the Ventre Wilderness and air quality monitoring that's been going on for 40 years there. So that's going to be at Snow King Resort at 7 o'clock. And I really encourage everyone, it's supposed to be a nice day, is to get out and spend a day in the wilderness celebrating the 50th anniversary.
So 3 things real quick. First of all, in 2 weeks' time, Mike Adler will be here to talk about some serious alpine geology, the Himalayas. So not only do you get a dose of geology, but you get some fantastic shots of scenery. I encourage you to come for that. Secondly, when you stand up, if you would be so kind as the people to my left, your right, if you would stack those chairs against this wall, and on this side, if you would stack the chairs over against the curtains over here, it would be greatly appreciated. And then again, I'd like to just ask you to join me in thanking the team that put together this great conference.